All right, so this week we are doing holy orders and not marriage. And so what I thought we could do is kind of pick up from where we left off last week. We kind of talked a little bit about priesthood and what a priest is and what a priest does. So that's kind of where we'll use as our launching point today. Move you guys over so that they can see this. I can just move over too. Hang on. All right, we're good. All right, so remember last week we talked about the two things that the priest does, right? So a priest is a mediator, and he has basically two duties, right? The mediator in the sense that he offers sacrifices to God and then calls blessings down from God. And so the Catechism says everything that the priesthood of the Old Covenant prefigured finds its fulfillment in Christ Jesus, the one mediator between God and men. Christian tradition considers Melchizedek, who we're going to spend a little time talking about today, priest of God Most High, as a prefiguration of the priesthood of Christ, the unique high priest after the order of Melchizedek, holy, blameless, unstained. By a single offering, he has perfected for all time those who are sanctified, that is, by the unique sacrifice of the cross. So what I thought we could do is go through the Old Testament types of priests, and then how they all point to Jesus, but in a certain sense, how they also all point to Adam, who was a priest and who, in a certain sense, was meant to be is sort of the archetype of what our priesthood looks like too. All right, and so how all of those things sort of fit back together is the direction we're going to go. All right, so first we're going to kind of build a foundation on the priesthood of Adam. Okay, and these are more. There's a lot on the slide, but we'll go through it kind of one by one to kind of build up what we're doing. All right, and so so in the beginning, right, on the fourth day, Genesis says, and God said, let there be lights made in the firmament of heaven to divide the day and the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. All right, so we read that for a second. We think, okay, well, that's fine. Like, you know, the lights in the heavens are basically like built-in calendars, right? But when Genesis uses the term seasons, it doesn't mean seasons in the sense of winter, summer, spring, and fall. It means it in the sense of liturgical seasons, right? So remember, and this is where we're gonna build off of. God made all of this, everything, right? All visible creation to be worship space for him, right? And so it would make sense that he's not just talking about, you know, summer, winter, spring, and fall. He's talking about liturgical seasons, right? And so where we're going to go with this is we're going to talk about how Eden is the first temple, all right, and Adam then being the first priest who serves there, all right? And if we go into Genesis chapter ahead, and we talk about Eden, Eden has a couple of sort of things that make it look like a temple. The first is it has a river flowing out of it that waters the whole world, right? That should sound a lot like the temple that Solomon built, but also Jesus, right? So we see that the Eden is a type of Jesus in a certain way. All right, so the garden was watered by a river. It came out from Eden and went on to divide into 4 branches. The first is called Pison. It is a river which surrounds all the country of Hevelath, a gold-producing country. No gold is better. Bdellium is found there too, and the onyx stone. All right, so why those particular things? Why is there gold and onyx? All right, well, we go and look at the temple that God commands them to build and what's in that temple. Gold and onyx stones, all right? And that's 1 Chronicles chapter 29. All right, so the water flowing at a side has gold and onyx stones, all right? So we're beginning to see maybe there's something more going on to the way it's created, all right? Good question. I have no idea. I think it's some kind of stone. I don't know. I don't know exactly what it is though. The question was, what is bdellium, which I don't know. If somebody online wants to Google it and throw it in the chat, I will enlighten Ryan with knowledge pretending it's mine. All right, so we have Eden being a temple, all right? And now we're going to look at Adam as a priest, all right? So what does a priest do in a temple? All right, well, he does the two things that a priest does, right? He offers sacrifice and calls down blessings upon mankind, all right? But there's this weird thing where God gives this command to Adam, right, about the garden, right? It tells him to work it and to guard it, right? And what does he mean by that? Well, if we flash forward ahead to Numbers and we look at what Aaron and his sons are tasked with doing, they're tasked to work and to guard the temple, right? And in particular, the tabernacle, right? And then they're supposed to kill anyone who comes and tries to enter, right? And so those two terms, those two Hebrew terms, Abadah and Shamar, are only associated with priestly activities. So I had to search around a little bit for different translations of Genesis to find good translations for those words. But think of them as priestly activities, all right, to guard and to serve. Okay. All right. So we have all the conditions now. We have a temple and we have a priest. Well, what's his sacrifice? What is Adam's sacrifice? Now, the snake was the most subtle of all wild animals that Yahweh God had made. It asked the woman, did God really say you were not to eat from any of the trees in the garden? The woman answered the snake, we may eat the fruit of the trees in the garden, but of the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden, God said, you must not eat it nor touch it under pain of death. Then the snake said to the woman, no, you will not die. God knows, in fact, that the day you eat of it, your eyes will be open and you will be like gods, knowing good from evil. The woman saw that the tree was good to eat and pleasing to the eye, and that it was enticing for the wisdom that it could give. So she took some of its fruit and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. All right. So we have Adam standing beside Eve, right, as this temptation is going on. So immediately, what's the sin of Adam, right? It's not just taking the apple from Eve; it's refusing to do what God has commanded him to do, right? And so in a certain sense, moving forward, we're all plagued with the fact that we can't make that sacrifice, right? Because ultimately that's what his sacrifice is supposed to be, himself, right? Adam's sacrifice is supposed to be himself, right? God has so made it so that we can, in a certain sense, be living sacrifices, Romans 12, which we talked about last week, and give ourselves completely and totally to God. Right, so God made creation that way, gave Adam a temple in which to do it, and Adam didn't offer the sacrifice. And so then we have to circle back around through Christ, who then who does it, and actually does die, but is alive again, and then empowers all of us to make that sacrifice. All right, and so that's the link. All right, and so Adam is the first priest, the first king, and the first prophet. All right, and so if you want to sort of understand like what God's original plan is, it's exactly what he carried out anyway, right? It's exactly, he just got there in a little circular route, but nevertheless he got there anyway, right? Where man can be priest, prophet, and king, speak for God, right?
Rob?
Yes.
So when it says that she gave some to her husband who was with her, do we know that with her means like he was literally standing right beside her?
Yeah, the word is actually, like, a translation of it is beside her. Yeah. 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 So literally next to, right? And so the thing, like, in a certain sense, Adam has already sacrificed himself once, right? Because where did Eve come from? Right? He shed his blood, presumably when the rib was taken out of his side for Eve, right? It's in this case that he doesn't. Okay. And you know, we could go way deeper into this, but just think about what is one of the things that Adam is looking for when God gives him Eve, right? He's looking at the animals and realizing none of them are helpmates. Helpmates for what, right? In sacrificing himself, right? In carrying out his duties as a priest, right? And so all throughout the Old Testament, it's always the patriarchs, the fathers, who are the priests, right? And then their firstborn sons, right? And then we have the example of Abraham and Isaac, right? And so again, if we read into this priestly language, it begins to make a lot more sense rather than we're not necessarily looking at him, looking and going, this is totally unintelligible. Why did God ask Abraham to sacrifice his son, right? So God says to Abraham, take thy only begotten son, Isaac, thy only begotten son, Isaac. And there thou shalt offer him for a holocaust upon one of the mountains, which I will show you. And on the third day, all this should be really kind of raising our typological ears. Lifting up his eyes, he saw the place afar off. And he took the wood for the holocaust and laid it upon Isaac, his son. Right, so he gives Isaac the wood for the holocaust. Who carries the wood for the holocaust? Isaac, right? So is Isaac a little tiny kid? No, right? Isaac is a big, strong guy who can carry the wood for his own sacrifice, right? And so this is Isaac, as his only begotten son, his first son, is actually the priest and the victim, right? He's the one going up the mountain, right? He's freely choosing to do it. Abraham is 100 and some odd years old, and Isaac is a full-grown man, and yet he goes and does it, right? And so this isn't necessarily like we tend to read into this. This is Abraham sacrificing Isaac. No, this is Isaac sacrificing Isaac, okay? Because he does it willfully, right? And you see so much of like Christ in that, right? You see how he embraces the wood for the sacrifice. And so it's not necessarily an act of cruelty, but it's meant to be typological, right? And so that then he gets to the top and they see the ram in the thicket, crown of thorns. But nevertheless, we should read into that. Again, it's a priestly act, okay? Priestly act. All right, so the firstborn sons are the priests throughout the Old Testament until we get to Mount Sinai, all right? And so those firstborn sons, when Moses is up on the mountain getting the Ten Commandments, they offer a sacrifice to the golden calf. And then what does God do? Well, he transfers the priesthood very adamantly to the Levites, okay? The chosen people was constituted by God as a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. But within the people of Israel, God chose one of the 12 tribes, that of Levi, and set it apart for liturgical service. God himself is its inheritance. A special rite consecrated the beginnings of the priesthood of the Old Covenant. The priests are appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. Okay, everything we just talked about, right? So the promise of Abraham for a great nation is really the promise that there will be a kingdom of priests, right? And this is what St. Peter's talking about when he talks about the royal priesthood, okay? But still, in the midst of that, the Jews still need a liturgical priesthood, right? So even though they are a kingdom of priests, they still need liturgical priests, right? Somebody who is responsible for leading the liturgy. The other part too.
Could all of the Jews have been considered priests, or is that something that we only experience now in the New Testament with baptism?
Yeah, in a certain sense, they could all be still considered priests, and we're going to talk about why in just a second. But they are a kingdom of priests, right? It's just liturgically the Levites are set apart, right? And in that sense, there's a parallel. The other part too is the priest not only offered sacrifices and not only bestowed blessings, but also forgave sins, right? And so the Leviticus chapter 5, when someone is guilty in regard to any of these matters, that a person shall confess the wrong committed, make reparation to the Lord for the wrong committed, female animal from the flock, a ewe, lamb, or she-goat as a purification offering. Thus the priest shall make atonement on the individual's behalf for the wrong, right? So the priests are given the power to make sacrifice for sin or to forgive sins, all right? So forgiveness of sins is somehow linked to the priesthood intrinsically, all right? All right, one more sort of step in the process, and then we'll get to we'll get into the New Testament. All right, so we've talked about numerous times about Melchizedek. Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High. He pronounced this blessing. Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High for putting your enemies into your clutches. Okay, so Melchizedek sort of comes out of nowhere. We talked about this a little bit, right? And in the Jewish Talmud and sort of in Jewish tradition, he's Shem, Melchizedek is Shem, which is Noah's first son, as a firstborn son. And the reason why they thought that, and the reason why it's a good explanation, is the fact that somehow he had some kind of superiority to Abraham, right? And so as his descendant, Abraham would have been a descendant of Shem, then this begins to make sense. But anyway, so this priest has a unique sacrifice of bread and wine, right? And yet he's still a priest of God Most High. And he, again, carries a blessing down upon Abram, right? And so the greater always blesses the lesser. But that's not the end of Melchizedek, right? Because David is also a priest in the order of Melchizedek, right? And we're going to talk about it in a second. And then this will then tie everything into Christ, all right? All right, so David, taking the Ark of the Covenant up to Jerusalem, came dancing before the Lord with a bandit girt with a linen ephod, which is priestly garb. They brought in the Ark of the Lord and set it in its place within the tent, which David had pitched for it. Then David sacrificed burnt offerings and communion offerings before the Lord. All right, so priest offering sacrifice. What does he offer? Burnt offerings and communion offerings before the Lord. When David had finished sacrificing burnt offerings and communion offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts and distributed among all the people the entire multitude of Israel, to every man and every woman, one loaf of bread, one piece of meat, and one raisin. All right. All right. So David is not a firstborn, right? And he's not a Levite. But nevertheless, when Samuel goes to meet David, Holy Spirit comes upon him, right? So he gets this stable possession of the Holy Spirit. And so from that day forward, David becomes not just the future king, but also a priest, right? And the reason why we know that is because later on, he will, in second Samuel, he will be running from Saul, and he goes into the temple and eats the showbread, him and his men, right? Now, who can do that? Only a priest. Okay, only a priest could do that, right?
Rob,
Yes.
this you might be able to say this to the other side, but so when it says David came to answer for the Lord with abandon, what does that mean? Because doesn't one of his, either his wife or one of his wives, get angry at him for doing that?
Yeah. So Saul's daughter, who was his wife, does because she thinks it's a little over the top. But other than that, that's it, right? That's all she says about it.
Okay.
Yeah. There's a joke there, but I won't say it. Okay, so Psalm 110, which now this is the link between Jesus and David as a priest, right? So Psalm 110 is you are a priest forever in the line of Melchizedek, right? And so David and his sons then were also priests, right? And so the Davidic king from that point forward was in the line of Melchizedek, was a priest according to the order of Melchizedek, all right? And then this makes, now going to the New Testament, something that happens totally intelligible, and it also helps us sort of set up what the order of Melchizedek looks like. So there's a point in Matthew's gospel where Jesus and his disciples are going through the cornfields on Sabbath, and they pick off the ears of corn to eat them. And the Pharisees noticed it and said, "Look, your disciples are doing something that's forbidden on the Sabbath." And what does Jesus say? Well, not just that they have to eat. He says, well, what about what David did, right? Who's allowed to work on the Sabbath? Priests, right? And so his response is not, well, look, they were hungry, or, he goes, well, what did David and the priests do, right? Same thing that these priests are doing, right? Because later on he says, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, right? Why? Well, because he is a priest, right? And because he's God. All right, so he says, have you not read what David did when he and his followers were hungry, and how he went into the house of God and they ate the loaves of the offering, although neither he nor his followers were permitted to eat them, but only the priests. All right. Or again, have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath day, the temple priests break the Sabbath without committing any fault? Right. So what's he implying? That he and the disciples are all priests. Okay. All right. And so that pulls us into the New Testament. Yes, Keith.
It seems to say here that they're not priests, or at least suggests that when it says that they were not permitted to eat them, but only the priests.
Yeah. So when he says, have you not read what David did when he and his followers were hungry and how he went into the house, that part, and they ate the loaves of the offering, although neither he nor his followers were permitted to eat them, but only the priests. Right. So, but what is he implicit? So what is he implicitly saying though? Not that they were not priests, but they weren't Levitical priests, right? Because then the second question then sort of closes the loop on that, right? Because he's saying, why don't temple priests break the Sabbath without committing any fault, right? So that's the link between the two. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess the line that's like confusing me is neither he nor his followers were permitted to eat them, and if they were priests, they would be permitted to eat them.
Yeah. So the point was that they were Levitical priests, not so. Neither is he, right? According to his point is like according to the law, neither are they, right? Neither is Jesus, and neither are apostles, right? So he's trying to get them again to think about the bigger picture of, well, if they actually ate the showbread, were they really priests, right? Just not priests of the order of Levite.
So that's what it is. There's just different orders. That makes more sense.
Yes. Yep. Yeah. And that if that question stopped there, then what you're saying would make perfect sense. It's the next question though that then opens up the whole sort of now view of something bigger than the priesthood, right? Than the Levitical priesthood. Okay. All right. So with that link, let's begin to look at Jesus's priesthood and then how he then pulls the apostles and then anyone else into sharing his priesthood. So the high priestly prayer, which happens in John chapter 17, which is the longest prayer of our Lord. He does three things. Okay. He prays for himself, he prays for his fellow priests, and he prays for all the people. All right. Why would he do that? Why? He said, Father, glorify thou me in thy own presence with the glory which I had with thee before the world was made. So he's praying for himself. I am praying for them. I am not praying for the world, but for those whom thou hast given me, for they are thine. Praying for the apostles. And then I do not pray for these only, but also for those who believe in me through their word. All right. And then praying for the rest, right? For all the people. Why that formula? Well, that's exactly the same formula that the high priest used in Leviticus. And Aaron shall offer the bull as a sin offering for himself, and shall make atonement for himself and for his house. And then he shall kill the goat of sin offering, which is for the people, and bring its blood within the veil, and do with its blood as he did with the blood of the bull, sprinkling on mercy seat before the mercy seat. All right. And so in praying this, if you're going to call it a high priestly prayer, then that's exactly how the high priestly prayer was made. Okay. And again, this is a little bit more like from an apologetic standpoint, but nevertheless, that prayer is not intelligible unless the apostles are also priests. Okay. And then we touched on this just a little bit yesterday or last week about what priestly ordination looked like. And I'll just kind of give you the proof text. So Exodus 29, you shall bring Aaron and his sons to the door of the tent of the meeting and wash them with water. And you shall take the garments and put on Aaron the coat and the robe and the ephod and the breastpiece, and gird him with skillfully woven band of the ephod. And you shall set the turban on his head and put the holy crown upon the turban, and you shall take the anointing oil, pour it on his head and anoint him. Then you shall bring his sons and put coats on them, and you shall gird them with girdles and bind caps by them, and the priesthood shall be theirs. Thus you shall ordain Aaron and his sons. All right. So it starts with washing them with water. And then Exodus 30 later on describes a little more. For ablutions, you shall make a bronze basin with a bronze stand, place it between the tent of meeting and the altar, and put water in it, Aaron and his sons shall use it when washing their hands and feet. When they are about to enter the tent of meeting, they must wash with water lest they die. Likewise, when they approach the altar to minister, to offer an oblation to the Lord, they must wash their hands and feet lest they die. It shall be a perpetual statute for him and his descendants throughout the generations. All right, and so what happens then in John chapter 13 is exactly the same thing. Came to Simon Peter and said, Master, why are you going to wash my feet? And Jesus answered him and said, what I am doing you do not understand now, but you will understand later. Peter said to him, you'll never wash my feet. And Jesus answered, unless I wash you, you will have no part with me, right? No portion, no share, all right? And so the Levites in Exodus chapter 40, the Levitical priests had a portion or a share in God, right? So if you flip to Exodus chapter 40, which I didn't put here. So this, what is going on is they're receiving the sacrament of holy orders. And then again, Jesus later says, and for their sake, I consecrate myself that they also may be consecrated in truth. And that word in Hebrew is ordained. Right? And just so it doesn't seem like I'm making all this up, Pope Benedict says the same thing. Jesus of Nazareth, he says, sanctify them in the truth. This is the true prayer of consecration for the apostles. The Lord prays that God himself draw them towards him into his holiness. He prays that God take them away from themselves to make them his own property, so that starting with him, they can also carry out the priestly ministry for the world, right? And so you see the traces of the matter and the form, okay? The washing of the feet, and then the words of Christ. All right, so that's the sort of the biblical basis of at least the priesthood of Christ, and then how he begins to share it with the apostles, and then men after him. So the next natural question is, why only men? Right?
Rob,
Yes.
are you going to talk about the origin of the three tiers of it, where you'd have the Levites?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. We're going to talk about, we'll talk about the matter and form of the 3 degrees of the priesthood. But I mean, we can talk about it just a little bit, even now, a little bit, just thinking about the manner in which Christ, when he institutes it at the Last Supper, he institutes not only the sacrifice, but the act of service, right? So, and the Greek word for service is diakone, right? And so what does he tell them? Well, do the same thing I did. And then does this talking about their act of service, right? So in a certain sense, he has made it so that the fullness of the priesthood revolves, or at least is found in the apostles and in the bishops to follow them. But then portions of the priesthood then fit with the presbyterate and the diaconate. But we'll talk more about it when we get there. All right, so why only men? All right, so the church, John Paul II in the 80s visited the question about whether women could become priests. And here's what he said: wherefore, in order that all doubt may be removed regarding a matter of great importance, a matter which pertains to the church's divine constitution itself, in virtue of my ministry of confirming the brethren, I declare that the church has no authority whatsoever to confer priestly ordination on women, and that this judgment is to be definitively held by all the church's faithful. All right, and so that is the language of infallibility. And he's essentially saying a couple of things. He's saying first that the church has no authority. Why doesn't the church have any authority to change who's ordained? Yeah, so sacraments are what? Instituted by Christ, right? And so nothing about the church does not have the authority to change anything of the sacrament, matter or form, right? We said like, liturgy wrapped around it, manner in which you select priests, whatever, but the matter and form of sacraments can never change, right? And this, now I realize this is probably a controversial statement, even though it ought not to be. This applies not to just priests and bishops, but also deacons. All right. Why would that be?
The diaconate is part of the priesthood.
Yeah. So the holy orders, the sacrament of holy orders, has different degrees, right? 3 degrees, which we'll talk about. but there are only differences in degrees, not differences of kind, right? So we say they're one sacrament, even though they have various degrees. And so if you were to say that, oh no, it's okay for women to be deacons, then you're saying that that's a different sacrament in kind, right? And thus we would have an eighth sacrament, right? And so, so that is the sort of the assumption behind it, right? And I think we've talked at sort of ad nauseum about why, from like a sacramental standpoint, why only men, and then just from an authoritative standpoint, because Jesus chose only men, right? And that wasn't accidental. Yes.
Just to play devil's advocate, I think I've heard I've heard people advance that there were deaconesses in the early church. Can you talk a little to that?
Yeah. So those were ministries and not ordained ministries. Like what's the word I'm looking for? They didn't involve the sacrament of holy orders. So deaconesses essentially assisted. I think all they did was assist at baptisms for women. And there's been minor orders throughout kind of the history of the church. And the church, it's kind of foreign. That idea is a little bit foreign to us now. This idea of minor orders, in which somebody could perform a certain ministry in the church, and but it's not an ordained ministry, so it's not one that in which you received holy orders.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but yeah, when you say especially they were assisting at baptisms, is because baptisms were done on fully nude adults, correct? So you didn't want to, you'd have women baptizing, you'd have women assisting women being baptized and men assisting.
Yes. Yep. And that's really, I mean, I think historically that's pretty much all they did was assisted baptisms. All right, so the second sort of unintelligible aspect of it, so the fact that they must be men, is celibacy. All right, so let's talk about celibacy in general, where it comes from, and then what it means. And so all the ordained ministers of the Latin Church, with the exception of permanent deacons, are normally chosen from among men of faith who live a celibate life and who intend to remain celibate for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Called to consecrate themselves with undivided heart to the Lord and to the affairs of the Lord, they give themselves entirely to God and to men. Celibacy is a sign of this new life to the service of which the church's minister is consecrated and accepted with a joyous heart. Celibacy radiantly proclaims the reign of God. All right, so first, in the Eastern Rite, they've had a different discipline that's been enforced for a while. Bishops have to be celibate. Married men can be ordained as deacons or priests. But in the Latin Rite, both priests and bishops have to be celibate. Deacons do take a vow of celibacy if their wife should die or if they're not married yet. Okay. So the argument here, yes.
How quickly did that tradition become, I guess, in force? Because I mean, I think you read in some of Paul's letters when he's giving advice to maybe Timothy or someone as like how they should pick bishops or how they should pick priests. He'll normally say like they should be the wife of one. They should have one wife. I think normally.
Yeah, when First Timothy, he talks about a bishop should only be married once. I mean, obviously Peter has a mother-in-law, and presumably a wife that is attached to the mother-in-law. By the well, certainly by the Council of Trent, when the church ceased calling married men to the priesthood, it was done away with. It took a while before that was the case, but there's a qualification there. So celibacy isn't just something the church came up with, right? So the priests in the Old Testament, in particular the high priest, when they were serving at the temple, that is offering the sacrifices, they would also have to practice continence, right, for some period of time before the sacrifice. All right. And so that idea, even though it was temporary, that's the seeds of it, right? And presumably, let's just start from the apostles, right? So the apostles, if they're saying daily mass, when do they offer the sacrifice? Every day, right? And so it begins to be where there's a perpetual celibacy, right? And so I think, I know that that's where the roots are already there. Okay. Now, Peter, as an example, because we know he was married, would have been celibate. All right, he would have gotten his wife's permission, but nevertheless would have lived a celibate life, right? And that again, in Luke chapter 18, our Lord says, he's talking about the rewards, and he says, "Those of you who have left wife and so forth and so on," right? And so he would have had to live as a celibate, okay, even though he was married. And again, that's not outside of the realm of sort of what Jewish priests already were doing, just temporarily, right? Yes.
And it like the pulled up, he had a mother-in-law, what about his like, and one of the theories is that his wife had died by the time Jesus came around, which kind of like makes sense because like it did not sit well with me that Jesus would be like, okay, I know I'm dying, so like you guys got married, and now just leave your life.
Yeah, so it wouldn't have been, so they would have lived still married, but celibate. So that's one like there's plenty of examples throughout. Like St. Paul is basically saying that, right? Like he's telling them to pick bishops that were only married once. So they're already married. It's not just ones that are like widows. So, I mean, I think tradition goes both ways on Peter. Go ahead, finish what you were saying though.
After Jesus heals his mother-in-law, it's his mother-in-law who like gets up right away and serving. Where normally if his wife were there, it would be the wife like getting up and serving and taking care of things that acute lack of the wife.
Right. So that's sort of the absence. So what Ryan is saying is she's just an example of Peter's mother-in-law actually getting up and serving. Why didn't Peter's wife do it? And that certainly, I mean, could be a legitimate. Yeah, there's no reason to like whether she was alive or not doesn't change the way the church interpreted it throughout history, right? Like a bishop could be married in the early church and for a long time, but if he was, he had to live a celibate life, and then so therefore to be a bishop, he would have had to have his wife's permission, and same thing with priests. And then it got to a certain point where, I mean, that's really a difficult life, right? A really difficult life. And so the church, definitively, the Council of Trent said, we're not going to call priests from the married state anymore. And then they did away with it. But that in and of itself is not necessarily, that could change. That aspect of it is a discipline, right? There's good reasons for it being a discipline. But, every so often the question of, well, there's a priest shortage, why don't they ordain married priests, right? And if they did, those men would have to live a celibate life, right? And so that's the part they usually, when someone's arguing for that, they omit that part, right? And so that's a very different very different priesthood, but that part was there from the very get-go.
Hey, Rob.
No, so the Eastern Church, for whatever reason, they interpret it differently. So because the priests in the Eastern, now they can't be bishops like in the Eastern Church, but the priests can be married and have, I mean, I know a couple of Eastern priests who have large families. And I don't know what that discipline entails, like as far as, their periods of continence or not, but in general, they can have families. So for some reason, that's just not something that in the Eastern Church has ever really taken root.
Hey, Rob.
Yes.
Yeah, because I know there's the thing now, like Anglican priests can come over and become Catholic priests. And I know one who, just had a child. So they're still intimate. I guess, do you think that this is kind of more of an opinion question? Do you think that's a good thing that the church is kind of welcoming them in? And I think some of them bring their whole parish over. Yeah, I was just kind of.
Yeah, the church would never ordain them as bishops. Do I think a married priest in the Anglican rite is a good thing for the church? Absolutely. And it's probably good for them too, right? Because one of the stumbling blocks for Protestants in general is always they lose their livelihood, right? A Protestant pastor loses his livelihood.
Mhm.
And so I think part of the Anglican rite, like the Eastern rite, is also to have married priests. And I don't think, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think it distorts the sign, which we're going to talk about in a second. But I don't think that immediately disqualifies it from being a possibility. Yes, Ryan.
You're having to come to 6 times a day, and he wouldn't be able to fulfill his priestly role if he was all of a sudden like, hey, actually, like, fabulous theological discussion, I need to take Megan to the dentist. I just like,
Yeah, the logistics of.
to serve.
So Ryan's talking about just the logistics of it being really difficult. Go ahead.
And then how would a Josephite marriage fit into
I mean, it wouldn't necessarily, right? So a Josephite marriage is just a marriage between. So the question is about a Josephite marriage. Is just a marriage between a man and a woman that's not consummated, and they've agreed for it not to be consummated. Now, those marriages, Josephite marriages, can be dissolved by the Pope. So if, like, for some reason they agreed to dissolve the marriage because it wasn't consummated, the Pope could dissolve it, and then they could enter the priesthood or something like that. But in general, like, the married state now in the Latin rite would disqualify you from the priesthood. Any other rites, it would just depend. But even if they were living a celibate life, a married celibate life, it wouldn't mean they could just go and be priests. So, I mean, all right.
Question, Rob.
Yes.
So what was so I guess I think, like Ryan said, I can understand the, I guess, kind of mystical aspect of like priestly celibacy, or like just celibacy in general, where you're like like you're wed to Christ, you're kind of like giving yourself, or that, like that kind of idea. And I can understand the idea of the logistical aspect of it, just from, okay, as a priest, if they have large families, it's going to be very hard for them to give themselves entirely to serving a parish when they have to be ultimately be having to try to serve their wife and serve their kids and things like that. I'm wondering, in the old law, like in the Old Testament, what was what was like the purpose or like the rationale then for like the continence? Because that, like, if you're saying, okay, this person's a priest, but they can have children, like outside of this period of time, they can have like a regular married life. Obviously, I know this is wrong, but it almost does seem to like lend arguments to those where it's like, okay, having marital relations is actually a bad thing, and it makes you impure to appear before God or something like that. So what was was it just fast forwarding celibacy? Was there some, or not flash forwarding, but like foreshadowing celibacy? Like what was it?
I think it's more of that. I think it's more of that, the sort of type, archetype idea that it was meant to show, like, for example, right? Like, they were considered unclean, right? And you could interpret that, right, as somehow that sex was dirty or something. And that's not really what it meant, right? And so I think it's more of just it's sort of typological aspect pointing ahead to the need, in a certain sense, to be, if you're going to be in persona Christi, a key aspect of Christ's purity is his virginity, right? And so to be signs of that virginity, and that's where the unclean, so the idea of unclean comes in, right? Like, unclean doesn't necessarily mean, in the sense we would think of it, as somehow the person is dirty, but in the sense that they're not conformed to Christ as as virgin, or Christ as the all pure one, and that, I think that's the only issue with it. I don't think there's anything. I don't think to read into it any more than that kind of just takes us down to like a Manichaean. Somehow we'll get into like a Manichaean understanding of things, where spirit good, body bad.
Got it. Thanks.
But it's clear that our Lord intended there to be what he calls eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. So it was clear that that it was meant to be a gift, right? He was able to receive this, let him receive it. And so in a certain sense, this idea, and this is, when we come back around to theology of the body, this is a really important aspect of it. But to see it as not necessarily as renunciation, but an acceptance of something more, something bigger, right? Like to see it as an acceptance of what the kingdom of heaven will actually look like. And then marriage then has a complementary view to it and not a negative view, as if somehow celibates are better than married people. All right, so the superiority, I guess the point is, the superiority is not in the fact that they're celibates, it's their reason to do it, right? They're doing it for the kingdom of heaven. All right, so Christ then, all right, so that again, to be fully conformed to Christ is purity. And then Christ's eternal priesthood, which meaning he now to the end of time offers sacrifice. It is the same priest, Christ Jesus, whose sacred person by his minister truly represents. Now the minister, by reason of the sacerdotal consecration which he has received, is truly made like to the high priest and possesses the authority to act in the power and place of the person of Christ himself. Christ is the source of all priesthood. The priest of the old law is a figure of Christ, and the priest of the new law acts in the person of Christ. Okay, so let's see if we can now swing this back around to where I said we were starting, and then we'll look at holy order specifically. All right, so last week we talked a little bit about this, about the distinction between the two priesthood, the priesthood of all believers, and the ministerial priesthood. Here's what the Catechism has to say, and then let's see if we can tie this then back to how they're related. The ministerial or hierarchical priesthood of bishops and priests and the common priesthood of all the faithful participate, each in its own proper way, in the one priesthood of Christ. All right, so what is the one priesthood of Christ? What is Christ's sacrifice? Himself, right? Okay, so we can see that the common priesthood shares in the priesthood of Christ in order to offer themselves, right? The ministerial priests still have that same obligation, right? Because they are a common priest as well, right? But then they have a unique role in that they also are ordered, thus the name holy orders, ordained to offer the sacrifice of Christ in the person of Christ, in the liturgy, okay, in the sacramental realm. So while being ordered to one another, they differ essentially. In what sense? While the common priesthood of the faithful is exercised by the unfolding of baptismal grace, a life of faith, hope, and charity, a life according to the Spirit, ministerial priesthood is at the service of the common priesthood. It is directed at the unfolding of the baptismal grace of all Christians. The ministerial priesthood is a means by which Christ unceasingly builds up and leads his church, and for this reason it is transmitted by its own sacrament, the sacrament of holy orders. All right. So the point of this is that the ministerial priesthood are priests for the church, the members of the church. That is what they are made for, right? The common priesthood are meant to be priests in the secular world, right? And in a certain sense, because we are so, we have such an ingrained habit of thinking somehow that like the priesthood of all believers is somehow something less than the ordained priesthood. Or even if we have this sort of exaggerated clericalism, that priests are there at the service of the members of the church, right? And anything they do that takes them away from that role isn't good, right? And this is why a lot of priests shy away from becoming celebrity priests, because they're evangelizing the world, right? That's our job, right? When God calls to the ministerial priesthood, he calls so that you can provide sacraments for the faithful. Right, first and foremost. That doesn't mean that somehow the world is off limits, but it does mean that the two should never conflict, right? Because the world is to be sanctified by the common priesthood, right? And again, the ministerial priests do share in that, and so they do have a role. But the point is that in this way they're complementary, right? Because at the end of Mass, what happens, right? Right? You guys are being sent out to sanctify the world.
Rob,
Yes.
Just try to make sure I understand what you're saying. So I remember, I think it was back during It was over the summer. I think it was during the time where they were staring at all the statues in California of various historical figures, and some of them being saints. I think there was a call like kind of going out, wanting maybe some sort of action on the part of the hierarchy of bishops at that point. And the Bishop Barron comes out with this. I think he sends out some sort of tweet and says, "That's not our job. That's the job of the laity." I think there was a backlash against that because I think the laity at that point was feeling like, where's our leadership? So is that, I guess, are you saying he was kind of right? Or are you saying is that not what you mean? Like, did you see what I'm saying? Are you
Yeah. Yeah. So in general, because of the culture that we live in, the faithful need to hear from Bishop Barron about that. Right now, how it stopped, I don't even remember like where. I think it was like a statue of Juniper Serra, right? Saint.
Probably. Yeah.
And it was on public. Was it on public land? It wasn't at a
I
church.
don't remember where I remember at some point people were trying to defend a church. I don't remember. I just remember the tweet and I remember the backlash.
Yeah. So his speaking out, the speaking out of bishops should always be directed to his flock, right? And that has to be done publicly plenty of times, right? So to simply just say that's the job of the laity, I think way oversimplifies, and maybe it doesn't sit well for that reason, right? He certainly does have an obligation to speak out because he does share in the common priesthood, but he also, the people need to hear from him, right? But he needs to direct his comments towards his own people and not necessarily towards the world, right? In general, right? But of course, situations arise where, priests and bishops do have to speak out, right? Because there's public things going on that could scandalize, so in that case, I think it probably would have been better if he wasn't going to say anything to not say anything, because that just muddies the water between the role because that's not entirely true, right? It's not entirely true that if somebody is destroying, public property, that the laity, that's their job, like go do that, right? It would be great if everybody pitched in.
But I guess so. But the idea behind this, which makes sense, that they're supposed to be, they're there to teach and to kind of direct, but it's the laity's job to, I guess, to put into action. Because in theory, at least, they're not really supposed to have, mass positions of power except under those who subscribe to the church, and those who are in the world are the ones supposed to be the Esters, kind of are supposed to be the ones that have.
Yeah, it's a little. I mean, again, I don't want to dive too deep. It's a little disingenuous on his part, considering the amount of time he spends on YouTube, right? Like that's clearly the lady's job, and I'm not saying that necessarily that's not helpful and that that Catholics don't benefit from that, but I am saying that he clearly. He's very clear that his role is to somehow sanctify outside the church. So why wouldn't it be to defend statues outside the church? I just think in that case, it was a poor choice of words, and just probably shouldn't have said anything at all if he wasn't going to confront it.
Okay, if we don't want to go time to, I have another question I have to ask, but we don't want to go too deep in that rabbit hole. I'll save it for later.
Okay, well, if I feel like we're going to get to, I'll cut the question off. So go ahead, ask.
So just so kind of with that, we talk about, especially with bishops, but even with priests, like part of their role being teaching, and obviously over the last, I don't know how many years, but certainly certainly in kind of modern day, we kind of come to the point where priests are maybe not, at one point we would say, okay, priests were the best educated. They were the ones who went off seminary, had the degrees in theology and all these kind of things. And so they were really the only ones that had the capacity to teach. Now we've had this shift, obviously, where the laity have come. It's far more common for the laity to be just as well, if not better educated than priests, sometimes within their own field. And so we have a much bigger push, obviously, with bigger names of Matt Fradd or Catholic Answers Live, Jimmy Akin, Trent Horn, like these laymen who are now kind of taken have made it their life's work to teach. Is that I guess, does that fit with the kind of, with like the role of the bishop's teacher, or is his, like, how do those roles, how do they differ? What's the cause of this rise, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So, well, the cause of the rise, I mean, I think you already talked a little bit about it. It's just the fact that we just have more access to the articles of faith. Some of that is the teaching church has been mostly silent, and so people have taken the bull by the horns, and come up with things like that. To like it just depends. Like Catholic Answers, right, is directed at mostly at Catholics, right? Although it does have a pretty large Protestant contingent. So I think as long as the in their teaching capacity, they have the permission of their bishop. I think that's that's a supportive role, right? It's when they begin to usurp the role of the bishop or in other ways, then I think that can be a problem. As far as I think it's just the nature of the overall silence in the church, from a providential aspect, is to activate the laity. Right? For the longest time, we just kind of were barnacles. And now we can't be anymore.
Yeah, so I guess that's the question. So people have made. I want to say it was Archbishop Fulton Sheen who made that statement, like this is the age of the laity or something like that. So do you think that is a? Do you think that that's a good thing, or do you think that this is a case where the children are having to kind of step up and fill the shoes that really they're like the spiritual fathers should be fulfilling?
Well, I mean, it must be a good thing if God's permitting it, but I think it's a good thing in general that that we have to learn and defend our own faith, right? Like it definitely, like in my own case, right? Like taking the time to be educated. My faith became mine, right? And I didn't necessarily depend on other people to tell me, how to believe, right? What to believe, yes, but not how to believe. And I think that's the gift of it. Is it in the grand scheme of things? Is this an aberration or the way it's supposed to be? I don't know. I think it's probably. I could see a way stronger church with a way better formed laity and in a hierarchy that was that was also running on all cylinders. Like I could see the two things being combined, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the church kind of reconquering the culture again.
Okay, thank you.
All right, where was I? All right, so let's talk about the sacrament itself, the effects of the sacrament, and then the 3 degrees. Holy Orders is the sacrament through which the mission entrusted by Christ to his apostles continues to be exercised in the church until the end of time. Thus, it is the sacrament of apostolic ministry. So what are the effects of the sacrament? Integration into one of these bodies in the church was accomplished by a rite called ordinatio, a religious and a liturgical act, which was a consecration, a blessing, or a sacrament. Today, the word ordination is reserved for the sacramental act, which integrates a man into the order of bishops, presbyters, or deacons, and goes beyond a simple election, designation, delegation, or institution by the community, for it confers a gift of the Holy Spirit that permits the exercise of a sacred power, which can come only from Christ himself through the church. Ordination is also called consecratio, for it is a setting apart and an investiture by Christ himself for the church. The laying on of hands by the bishop with the consecratory prayer constitutes a visible sign of this ordination. All right, and so Holy Orders gives a sacramental character the way baptism does, and then it, like all things that are all sacraments with a character, those deputize or mark someone to do certain things, right? So the deacon is marked to serve at the altar, right? And so he can assist at the Eucharist and administer baptism. The priest can confer the Eucharist and absolve sins. And so he's deputized to do that. And then the bishop has the fullness of the priesthood. And so he can do all of those things, plus ordain other men to do those things. Okay. And so so the effects then are simply those direct. All right. So what about the 3 degrees? The divinely instituted ecclesiastical ministry is exercised in different degrees by those who, even from ancient times, have been called bishops, priests, and deacons. Even from like the very get-go, like we see, like in Acts, right? Is when which we'll come back to in a second when we talk about deacons. But all three orders are there from the very beginning. Catholic doctrine expressed in the liturgy, the magisterium, and the constant practice of the church recognizes that there are 2 degrees of ministerial participation in the priesthood of Christ, the episcopacy and the presbyterate. The diaconate is intended to help and to serve them. For this reason, the term sacerdos in current usage denotes bishops and priests, but not deacons. Yet Catholic doctrine teaches that the degree of priestly participation, episcopate and presbyterate, and the degree of service are all three conferred by a sacramental act called ordination. That is by the sacrament of holy orders. And so they're 3 different, not 3 different sacraments, but 3 different sacramental grades. And they form one sacrament and with 3 different degrees, okay? So the bishop receives the fullness, right? And then everything else, the priest and the deacon then are ordered to serve and to assist him, right? And just like in the Old Testament, the Levites, right, there were the high priests and then the other priests who would assist the Levites. And then you'll see in the New Testament, you'll necessarily see the word bishop, but the Greek word is episkopoi, and they're usually called overseers. And then there's presbyters and deacons. Sorry, presbyters are the priests. You also see Saint Peter calls himself an elder. Yes.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
I think it was recently Pope, or I don't know, a couple years ago, Pope Francis said that like now priests can forgive like the sin of abortion, but before I thought like only bishops could. Like, why could only bishops forgive that sin? Why do you have to go to them? And like, why the shift?
Yeah, so that's just a canonical, that's just canon law, right? Like so the Pope can alter that in any way that he sees fit. The reason why it was that way in the past is because the sin of abortion carries with an automatic excommunication. And so only in that situation of excommunication can the bishop readmit the person. And so now he has, for that specific sin, made it so that if a valid confession actually re-communicates, I don't know if that's what you would, un-excommunicates. I don't know what the official term is. Yeah.
So, Rob, is it still auto excommunicable?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Rob,
Yes.
So as we talked about earlier, kind of the 3 degrees and those kind of related to the Old Testament. As I think even relatively recently, there's what you had another commission on having female deacons. Do you think in I guess this is more of your kind of judgment on it. Do you think most of those who are hoping that is the way hoping that that's what the commission finds and hoping that that's what the church teaches, do you think is it more just a means to an end? Do they really think like, okay, this is like how the sacrament works? Or are they just hoping that it really how it works is that everybody should be able to be, any woman should be able to be a bishop or something like that? And
I think it's an attempt and an end around to have some sort of crack in which a woman can enter into holy orders. And you could easily see, well, if she can receive holy orders in the diaconate, why can't she receive it? And that is not to say that, Pope Francis is in favor of that. I mean, sometimes these commissions, like we saw with Humani Vitae, right? Sometimes what comes out of them is very clear thinking, right? And even that quote from the Catechism that I had on the slide right before this is really kind of long and drawn out. And it seems to be saying two opposing things. It seems to say that the diaconate is different, but then it's saying, oh no, it's only one sacrament and different orders. And so a theology of the diaconate would be a great gift, and especially if it spilled over to the priesthood. But one of the best, Cardinal Mueller has a book that he wrote 10 or 15 years ago on the priesthood and diaconate, where he actually asked the same, that really, I mean, he's already done the work of the commission on deacons and whether women can be deacons. But his point is that, that there still needs to be a lot of clarity there. And you can see that's why the Holy Spirit does what he does, right? Yes, Ryan.
terms of sisters and nuns. Like, isn't it a totally different sacrament?
Yeah, so Ryan's question is, do nuns receive a sacrament? No. So they just pledge or consecrate themselves to that whatever order it is, but that is not a sacrament. That's why people, like they think it somehow is unfair, right? Like, because I remember, like, what would that? Remember how we had the parallels between the sacraments, right? What role would that fill? Right, because the Holy Orders was ordered towards governance of the society that is the church, right? Whereas you don't have, there's no reason to have another sacrament, right? Okay, so bishops, we find a couple examples. St. Timothy most certainly was a bishop, and we find in St. Paul's second letter, talks about, I remind you to stir into flame the gift of God that you have through the imposition of my hands. And he's talking about when he ordained him as a bishop, and then says not to lay hands on anyone too readily. So it shows two things. It shows that Timothy was a bishop with the power to do what the apostles could do, right? Lay hand on someone or to fulfill their exalted mission, the apostles were endowed by Christ with a special outpouring of the Holy Spirit coming down upon them, and by the imposition of hands, they passed on to their auxiliaries the gift of the Spirit, which is transmitted down to our day through episcopal consecration. I think we already talked about, I think several times in the past year, about apostolic succession and what it means and doesn't mean, so we can go over that really quickly. So apostles were not in the business of ordaining other apostles, right? So the office of the apostle, there was 12 of them, well, 13 of them, included St. Paul, and that was it, right? So when they were done, they were done. That's not a, but what they were was there were certain aspects of apostolic power that they were transmitting. One of those was to build and to govern a church. So they would, their role was ubiquitous, right? They were supposed to go to the ends of the earth. And then they would ordain men in a given area to govern the church that they founded there. And so, and this becomes clear when you think about how Mattathias becomes an apostle, right? The church doesn't pick him, God does, right? But Timothy is actually a bishop somewhere. I don't think we know exactly where he was the bishop of. But he was ordained by St. Paul and then stays in that place where he was, right? So apostles could be bishops. Some of them were, some of them weren't. Like St. James was not a bishop anywhere. St. Peter was. St. Thomas was not a bishop anywhere.
When you say he wasn't a bishop, you mean they didn't have a see, but they still had all the powers, I guess, of a bishop.
Yeah. So they had the powers of the apostles, right? Like a subset of that is the powers of being a bishop. So they could slide into the role if they needed to. But they also had, powers to, apostolic powers to spread throughout the world. So God never intended the apostolic office to end, to be for the rest of time, right? But he did intend for the certain powers of the apostolic college to endure throughout the church, and that's what we call apostolic succession.
So obviously Christ instituted Peter as the first pope and gives him kind of a very explicit instructions of that, make it clear that he's the first pope. Is there because now it's done by voting, correct? It's done by voting the College of Cardinals. Is that something the church has just decided, like that's how it's going to do it? Has there, like, how did they pick Linus after? Was it Linus after Peter?
Yeah, I don't know that we have a whole lot of understanding as to how Linus, Cletus, Clement, how all of them actually became Pope. But that can be left to the church, right? Because throughout the history, the church has done things differently, right? It could very well have been that Peter picks a successor, and then the next person picks their successor, and then the next. So that's not necessarily governed in any way by, in any necessary way by the sacrament. But nevertheless, like how the church decides is totally up to the church. Just like how they decide to form priests, or how they pick men for the priesthood is totally up to the the individual bishop.
Okay.
All right, let me see. We talked about a lot of these things. Let me just see where we're at here. All right, so we already talked about throughout Acts of the Apostles, you'll see the term presbyter, and you see the apostles appointing presbyters in each church, right? And with prayer and fasting, commending them to the Lord, in whom they put their faith. And so each church, each local church had not only a bishop, but also a set of priests or presbyters. And then, so we see presbyters from the beginning. And then we already talked about this, that, priests technically share the priestly office of the bishop. Matter and form, no idea why that green line is sitting right in the middle of the slide. In the ordination of presbyters, the matter is likewise the laying of the bishop's hands on the individual candidates that is done in silence before the consecratory prayer. The form consists in the words of consecratory prayer, of which the following belongs to the essence and are consequently required for validity. Almighty Father, grant to these servants of yours the dignity of the priesthood, renew with them the spirit of holiness. As co-workers with the order of bishops, may they be faithful to the ministry that they receive from you, Lord God, and be to others a model of right conduct. So that's matter and form. All right, so the diaconate, which we already talked about the fullness. We talked about deacons, about receiving a sacramental character, matter and form. In the ordination of deacons, the matter is the laying of the bishop's hands on the individual candidates that is done in silence before the consecratory prayer. The form consists in the words of consecratory prayer, of which the following belong to the essence and are consequently required for validity. Lord, send forth upon them the Holy Spirit, that they may be strengthened by the gift of your sevenfold grace to carry out faithfully the work of the ministry. All right, questions?
What apostolic powers do the apostles have that the bishops don't have?
I would say the let's see specifically what powers they had. That's a good question. I haven't really thought about it, but I was just thinking in sense of.
I mean, would it be strictly like supernatural, prophecy, healing?
Well, I mean, certainly part of what the apostles had, right, was the divine revelation, the power of divine revelation, right? That would be part of it. The other part would be something along the lines of being able to found churches.